Our idea tonight is to hear from each one of our panelists and then go to questions. The topic, you may recall, was twofold: the Philippine elections and their aftermath. And we find ourselves in a bit of a dilemma. We're in limbo. We have some notions, we have some information, we think we have some perceptions about the Philippine elections, but none of us were there, and it's not over yet. The result is not in. The counting is not finished. And therefore we have to move to the second part of our title, of our topic, which is the aftermath, without having the base of knowledge that we'd ideally like to have about the election result themselves. This makes it difficult for us. And I've asked the panelists to really emphasize more their thoughts about what is likely to happen, what are likely to be the consequences in whatever time frame they'd like to handle, making whatever assumptions about the election outcome they want to make, which they will share with you. But the idea is to start thinking about likely scenarios or contingency situations in the Philippines with regard to how the government may be constituted and behave, with regard to what the opposition might look like, with regard to the position of the church, the various actors. I've invited them to make comments on what they think the U.S. policy might be or should be. Certainly the NPA, the various actors and political constituencies that make up the Philippines. What is likely to be the patterns? What is likely to be the conditions that are going to play out over the next few months? Before we begin, however, I'd just like to say a couple of words about the elections themselves, as little as we know about them. I am a political scientist who in the last several years especially have been giving attention to American participation in its political system. And one of the things that worries me is that we all too often express our political participation in terms of apathy or in terms of narrow passions, rather than broad, active participation in the electoral process and in the institutions of government, the way we were expected to do when this country was founded, hoping that we would be dedicated to being and we would be capable of being our own governors. We have seen in the last few days the people of the Philippines demonstrating perhaps a greater passion and dedication and willingness to sacrifice for the democratic ideal than we in this country, with much more privilege and much more protection and much more stability, are able to muster. So I just want to start out, I'm sure this is on everybody's minds, it isn't an original contribution I'm making to our thoughts this evening, with a real statement of sympathy and respect for what the Philippine people have been through in this election period, for the marvelous efforts they've made, for the courage they've shown, for the dedication they've shown to shared ideals. There will be more challenges ahead, for the election is merely one chapter in this unfolding struggle. But what has gone on there and what has happened there deserves our great compassion and our great respect, and I just wanted to start out with that note. Many people here in the panel and here in the audience, have special relationships with the Philippines and with people who are in the Philippines. And without encroaching on any of your special relations and special thoughts for what has been going on there and people you know there, I really want to mention one thing that is important to us here at the Kennedy School. In 19 80 and 81, there was an MPA Mason Fellow at the Kennedy School whose name was Avilio Javier. And he was a friend of Benigno Aquino, and he had come to the Kennedy School to study just after having been provincial governor of Antique Province. And he became a dear friend of many of us here. He was my advisee and a student in a class I taught, and we became close friends, and our two families became close friends. He went to live for a while in Southern California, hoping to fight the battle, to carry the banner, working in this country for principles of Philippine independence and democracy. But he couldn't handle that. He had to get back to politics in Manila, and he left his family basically for safety purposes, in his two children and his wife in Los Angeles, and went back, ran unsuccessfully for the National Assembly, and in a contested election, which was still pending before the Supreme Court, yesterday, when he was assassinated in the capital of Antique Province, right in the plaza near the provincial capital where he had served as governor. So without putting a pall on the proceedings, I merely wanted to share with you, and many people in the audience knew Evie Javier, our sadness at losing someone whom we loved and whom we worked with and hope to work with in the future, who is a casualty of these events and of this election and of this continuing struggle which we have come here to discuss tonight. I want to start by asking Arnold Zeitlin, who is sitting on my left, to begin. He has long served with the Associated Press in Boston and is presently working also as a freelance writer to many journals and magazines, also doing radio and television commentary. He once served in the Peace Corps in Ghana and had a journalist career which had him serving in West Africa, in Pakistan, and in Afghanistan. And from 1973 to 1976, he served as the chief of the Associated Press Bureau in Manila, and he's become an expert on the Philippines and has written about the Philippines and has traveled to the Philippines since then. And it is my pleasure to ask Arnold Zeitlin to start off our comments and our conversations tonight.
Thank you very much. I'm taking a somewhat grim satisfaction from this scene and the election, in the sense that 10 years ago, I and other foreign and some Filipino journalists were reporting on the picture in the Philippines, and there were very few people reading or listening. And I'm heartened by the amazing interest in the United States, particularly since the assassination of Benigno Aquino in 1983, and the remarkable attention being paid to the elections here now. I would like to welcome you. I sometimes feel like saying, where were you 10 years ago? But I think that the attention we're giving this election scenario in this country in the long run will have great benefit for the Philippines. For a time, when the idea of election was broached earlier this year, I thought an election would be a disaster in the Philippines. My feeling is that the principal immediate problem in the Philippines is getting rid of Ferdinand Marcos. And I did not believe that an election was the way to do it. I believe, frankly, that the only way to get rid of Marcos is the same way he brought himself to power, in 1972 with the imposition of martial law, and that is basically through the barrel of a gun. I believe still to this moment that Marcos will remain in power, and will remain in power until he, one, demonstrates that he no longer can maintain control in the Philippines, or he will die in office. Sam Huntington just the other day published an article in International Security, which is quarterly published here, saying essentially the same thing, and I think that is basically a valid forecast. Marcos, I think, demonstrated his ability to maintain control in the aftermath of the Aquino assassination. I felt if there was ever a time to topple his government, that was the moment, and he has ridden that moment out to progress on to this next dangerous chapter in Philippine history. But he still maintains, as well as anyone else in the Philippines, I think you have to remember that this is a situation of relativity, more control than any other single individual, despite his age and his more feeble condition than he was 10 years ago. But the election hasn't been the total disaster, despite the very close loss that this school's family suffered with the loss of Emilio Javier. The election has focused a very bright spotlight on the Philippines. And I'm taking heart in the hope that there is really no place to hide what's been going on in the Philippines now. There are no dark corners, I hope. And you and millions of people who form a television audience here, and I was on the phone last night to Japan, the attention that it's getting in Japan is somewhat similar to the intensity it receives here, can now see for yourselves what's happening in the Philippines. No amount of writing or reporting from the Philippines can carry the same immediacy as 10 minutes of an interview with Ferdinand Marcos on American television. That will explain a lot more to you than anything anyone there can write. So from that point of view, I think the election and the process surrounding it will have, in the long run, a positive effect in the Philippines. I think that there's no doubt that the Philippines, or that Marcos, will emerge as the winner in this election. I've always thought that was the case. I thought that it would be done a lot more smoothly than it has been done. And perhaps that thought is a result of being too closely involved in Filipino affairs. I do not believe that the opposition, despite the tremendous boost it has gotten, it has performed remarkably. Its vote record is magnificent. And it's true it has established itself as a second party, although I would not go as far as to say that there is a two-party system in the Philippines. Because if nothing else, there's a huge party of the disaffected in the Philippines, which is represented by neither Marcos or Mrs. Aquino, that someday we will have to come face-to-face with and to deal with. I think, frankly, from the remarks of the President 10 minutes ago, it's quite obvious that the United States is prepared to accept Marcos as the President of the Philippines for another 6-year term. And I'm sure he will take advantage of that and milk it for all it's worth. Whether Mrs. Aquino has the power, the ability to mount the kind of opposition that's needed, and I think it's rather a dirty opposition because they're being played dirty with. If she's able to meet that, if she's able to summon up the energy that's now behind her, then there will be a great deal of difficulty in the Philippines. That would, in a way, be my hope. But I tend to believe that it's not going to happen, if only because Filipinos do show a remarkable talent for accommodation. And I do believe that the Reagan administration is prepared to support the decision of what I believe has been shown to be a rigged election. I think we saw the preparation for that in this press conference segment this evening. I would like to see the United States essentially detach itself and let the Filipinos decide their fate. I would like the responsibility for what happens in the Philippines to be totally Filipino. I don't believe that'll happen. Because even detaching this country, say in the form of suspending military assistance, of being more careful about where our economic assistance goes, would in a sense be taken as moves against the present regime. I think in the long run that this country would be better off if we began to learn to live without our major military bases in the Philippines, Clark and Subic, because I think the price we now pay for them is too high, if that price means supporting 6 more years of Ferdinand Marcos in office. And I think, too, that we should take a longer look at the so-called communist threat. Now, here my colleagues and friends think that I underestimate that threat, and perhaps I may be wrong here. As I said before, I think there are a great many disaffected people in the Philippines, and with good reason for their disaffection. But I don't think, essentially, that either Ferdinand Marcos or Cory Aquino are the bulwarks against the spread of communism in the Philippines. I think the roots, to get to the roots of that disaffection, and if you want to call it communistic, that's all right with me. But I think it would be a mistake to see it as part of a worldwide movement. I think the disaffected in the Philippines are essentially ideological. I don't think they're connected to any particular Chinese movement. I don't think they're connected in any great extent to any Soviet movement. And I wish that we could learn to deal with the Philippines outside the communist threat. I think it would do the Filipinos a greater benefit. And besides, when I arrived in the Philippines in 1973, I was told in 5 years the communists would take over. And when I left in 1976, I was told in 5 years the communists would take over. When Ninoy Aquino came here in 1980, I was told in 5 years the communists would take over. And now I'm reading that that timetable is still 5 years. So we seem to have a rather movable deadline. And I think we don't have to worry about the communists for 5 years or for 10 years or maybe till the end of the end of the century. As I say, I think I'm in the minority in that position, but I really believe it's true. The lessons of this election has been that the whole world has had the opportunity to see that Ferdinand Marcos is a liar and has no credibility outside the Philippines. But you must remember that he still has considerable credibility inside the Philippines, because if 50 or 45 or 55% of people voted for Cory Aquino, the rest of them voted for some reason for Ferdinand Marcos. And many of them felt that their interest was best served by voting for him. That group of people should not be forgotten. I also hope, and I'm going to take a slightly broader view here, that we will re-examine our insistence, our belief, our willingness to believe that authoritarian figures of the right bring stability, and that they necessarily are better than what follows their downfall. If we in the United States can bring away that kind of lesson, I think the elections in the Philippines would have been great benefit to us. We've just had the example of flying away on an Air Force plane, Jean-Claude Duvalier. Perhaps someday that plane may accommodate Mr. Marcos. I don't know. But I think, unfortunately, he has joined a peculiar hall of fame that we seem to have established in the type of authoritarian leader we tend to embrace. And I thought I'd end this with just a roll call of some of those people, with Ferdinand Marcos topping the list, and of course Jean-Claude Duvalier, and Samuel Doe, and Jonas Savimbi, and Augusto Pinochet, and General Suharto, and General Numeri, and Anastasia Somoza, and General Zia of Pakistan, and Yahya Khan, and Park Chung-hee, and remember Chun Do-hwan when you see the 1988 Olympics from Korea, the Shah of Iran, Long No. I hope that in some respects the election represents the high watermark of our willingness to embrace such individuals. Thank you very much.
On my right is Macarthur Corsino, who is currently a fellow at the Center for International Affairs here at Harvard. He recently resigned from the Foreign Affairs Ministry of the government of the Philippines and endorsed the Aquino candidacy because, as he stated at the time, and he may tell you more about this if he wishes, he could no longer defend the Marcos regime. He has been a diplomat in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. He served as acting director of the U.S. Division 1983 until present, till recently. He was also, it's interesting to note in terms of a sub-theme for this discussion tonight, which is the U.S. bases, that he was executive officer of the Philippines Office for Philippine-U.S. Base Agreement in 1983. In the past, he served as vice president for academic affairs at Andres Bonifacio College in the Philippines and has been associate professor of political science at Silliman University. My pleasure to introduce Macarthur Corsino. We're very happy that you're with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moore. I would like to begin by saying that, yes, I resigned my position from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs because it was very clear already that Marcos was or had become a liability rather than an asset to the Philippine Republic, and that his usefulness to the Filipino people was already a thing of the past. And what we needed was a leader whose very image would not arouse controversy, criticism, or condemnation, but somebody who instead would inspire sympathy, support, and cooperation, both from within the Philippines itself and from outside the Philippines. Such kind of sympathy and support for a new leader would really be necessary if the Filipino people were to unite to begin the long and tedious process of solving the economic problems, of managing the insurgency problem, and of bringing about political stability in the country as a whole. So after a few weeks of agonizing over the matter, I decided once and for all it was time to resign from my position. With regard to this election itself, along with many other Filipinos, I believe that this was the once in a lifetime opportunity to replace Marcos with a leader who, as I said, could inspire cooperation and sympathy from people here and within the Philippines and outside. We looked, and I looked upon this election as the only chance for a peaceful transition, non-violent transition to a new leadership, because if Marcos were to be re-elected and he died in office within a year or so, there would be possibilities of a power struggle and greater violence in the country. So this was, we thought, once in a lifetime chance to finally replace him. As it turned out, from the reports that we hear from the Philippines, this election should certainly go down in history as the dirtiest election the Philippines ever had. Never before was the government so mobilized completely, absolutely, from the national level down to the smallest barangays to try to bring out the vote for Mr. Marcos. There was rampant vote buying all around. People were being carted to attend his, carted in buses and other vehicles to attend his rallies. They were actually being paid to attend these rallies. So many popular actors, actresses, singers were paid out or were paid by the government to attract crowds. And we all know that salaries, salary bonuses were given to employees during Christmas time and shortly before the election began. I used to be the president of the Personnel Association of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And in the past 2 years, we used to have a very hard time convincing the president to give us 1 month's Christmas bonus during the Christmas season. We had to send resolutions, telegrams before our request for a Christmas bonus was considered in conversation between the President and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. But this time, there was no need for such telegram. There was no need for any such resolutions. The bonus was given, and not only to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or to selected ministries, but it was given to all government employees. And as I said, shortly before the election began, all the employees of the government were again given 2 weeks' salary, worth of salary. So there was rampant vote buying. Of course, there was intimidation, and I can picture myself in my mind, what kind of sacrifice and heroism many people underwent in order to try to preserve the sanctity of their vote. The non-frail volunteers are to be really congratulated for this heroic effort to try to keep the election clean. Many people have died trying to preserve the sanctity of the ballot. Now, Mr. Marcos, in his statements on American television, says or denies such violence or fraud ever taking place without batting an eyelash. Therefore, it's very clear he has really lost his credibility. I mean, he just tells lies left and right. And who is the person in the Philippines who would have the power, the authority, the machinery, the guns to institute or to perpetrate fraud, intimidation, and violence? who in the Philippines has a monopoly of legitimate force, that is in quotation marks, legitimate force. If not for the military combined with his political party machine, the KBL. So it was quite disappointing as far as some of us were concerned to hear President Reagan very equivocal about fraud and intimidation occurring in the Philippines. If you will allow me, I would just like to cite certain points here that I prepared about what possibly would happen if Marcos were to continue in office. First of all, the question is, if Marcos were to continue in office, do the majority of the Filipino people really recognize him as their legitimate president? And I'm afraid the answer is no. When Marcos called for an election last November 3, 1985, he did so because he thought he was going to prove that he had widespread popular support, that this was going to be a new mandate for him. The question is, did he really get this mandate? And the answer is no. On the other hand, it was Mrs. Aquino who got the mandate. She drew spontaneous crowds. She did not have to buy votes. She did not have to give away money, t-shirts, snacks, just to gather a crowd. No. In fact, people were the ones buying her t-shirts. The t-shirts printed with her face and name on it in order to contribute to her funding. Now, Marcos apparently, I would say, lost this election. There are indications to believe that Marcos actually lost this election, but that within 30 hours after the election returns came in, he activated a contingency plan to manipulate the results of the election. While we may not have all the proof for this, it is evident by analyzing the preliminary reports that we received from the Philippines that there was this organized and well organized attempt to manipulate the results, and this can be deduced by the actions of Marcos himself. On Philippine time, Saturday, February 8th, sometime in the afternoon, he knew that he had lost, and therefore he threatened to invalidate the results. And he suggested that he might continue in office by serving out the remaining months of his term until 1987. Why do I say that I know Marcos has lost? While it is true that it may take several days for the ballot boxes and the tally sheets inside the ballot boxes to be brought into Manila by boat, by plane, or by bus, Marcos has his own intelligence gathering network. He has an extensive apparatus coterminous with the KBL network, spread out in 40,000 barangays, 2,500 municipalities, 66 cities, and 73 provinces. Within hours after the election precincts close, Marcos will be already receiving by telegram or by telephone the actual results or the trend of the results or from all over the Philippines. And it is clear that from these trends, he knew that he was going to lose. So, at first he threatened to invalidate the results. Then, later on, we read that international observers began to question why the COMELEC So the Commission on Election results were stopped or were being delayed. And then subsequently, we hear about 30 COMELEC computer operators who walked out of their jobs because they could no longer bear the manipulation of the results. At about the same time, after the walkout, Marcos, interviewed on TV, was strongly now in favor of continuing the counting of the results, the conclusion of the COMELEC and NAMFREL results, which means that after that time, within 30 to 36 hours after the the polls had closed, the tampering of the votes by the COMELEC people or by KBL warlords or provincial and city leaders of the president had already taken place. So my concluding remark here is that the outlook for the Philippines is certainly bleak, and it is hoped that somehow efforts can be done within the Philippines and outside of the Philippines to help convince the members of the National Assembly to stick to the original real results of the elections and not manipulate them to make Marcos win. Thank you.
Richard Haas is a lecturer in public policy at this school, and he's also a faculty associate of the Center for Science and International Affairs of this Kennedy School. He served as deputy in the Bureau of European Affairs in the Department of State, and he also served as director of the Office of Regional Security Affairs in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs in the Department of State. In the past, he has been a legislative assistant in the U.S. Senate, and he was a Rhodes Scholar. And just to bring you up to date, he has recently returned from a trip to the Philippines, and we are grateful for him coming to join this panel tonight. Dr. Haas.
Let me just begin with a few remarks about what I think will happen, and then talk a little bit about what might happen, and then end up with a discussion of what I think United States policy will be towards the Philippines. The first question, what will happen, I think is the easiest, and I think it's been obvious since President Marcos several months ago surprised the viewers of the Brinkley Show one Sunday morning by talking about snap elections. And I think that it is President Marcos will win. The degree of fraud or whatever has always been the only question. He would have preferred to win a fair election, but failing that, he would prefer to stay in office, and I think that is clear. Indeed, I think really the only interesting question right now is who wins the vice presidency. In the Philippines, one has the option of splitting one's ticket. One literally has a ballot which has the word president in a blank line, vice president in a blank line. So it is not inconceivable that Mrs. Aquino's candidate for vice president, former Senator Laurel, could actually emerge as the winner of the vice presidency instead of Mr. Marcos' running mate, former Senator Tolentino. That is up in the air, and I think it is something to keep your eye on for reasons I will get back to later. But in general, I think that one can safely assume that President Marcos will remain in office. What then? I think the key to what happens in the Philippines, not simply for the next few days or weeks, but beyond that, is the reaction of Mrs. Aquino and the UNIDO, or the general opposition. And the real question for them then is how to react to this state of affairs. Does she, as she has threatened to do many times on television, go to the streets and lead a mass protest of civil disobedience or something more? I would argue that if she does this, it would most likely lead to considerable repression, that Mr. Marcos still clearly commands the overwhelming loyalty of the police and the military, that despite the presence of a small reformist movement in the military, the so-called We Belong movement of younger political officers, he can count on the support of the key military leaders in the Philippines, who not coincidentally control most of the troops and equipment and so forth near Manila, and that if it is necessary to bring out the troops to retain law and order, he will do so, and he will be able to maintain law and order. Indeed, it is for that reason, in large part, that I think Mrs. Aquino would be wise to rethink her plans. And as tempting and as indeed perhaps as understandable as it would be to lead a protest and to lead a massive campaign against the government, I think it would only play into the hands of those around Mr. Marcos, and conceivably even him, who would like nothing more than to see a situation in which the so-called legitimate opposition got delegitimized, in which, in a sense, he could once again remove them from the political spectrum. The other group which has an interest in bringing this about as well would be what you might call the illegitimate opposition, or the Communist Party of the Philippines, and their military adjunct, the New People's Army. Contrary to Mr. Zeitlin, I do take the communist threat in the Philippines quite seriously. I think the numbers are important in terms of the members of the party, the members of the military, the over 1 million people in various front organizations, and the fact that they do control increasing amounts of the countryside, and not simply far from Manila. I was in a town 9 miles from Manila in which protests had taken place. The mayor of the town had been threatened and indeed had received a black ribbon in the mail the day after a funeral march at which hundreds of people had been protesting the death of an NPA insurgent. So it is not something just out far away from Manila, but it is indeed fairly close. And whether or not estimates 10 or 15 or 20 years ago were somewhat alarmist, I do not think the estimates now are. And I think that one should take seriously the prediction that there could be something like a strategic stalemate in the Philippines in 3 to 5 years if current trends continue. Again, though, I think the scenario and the future of the Philippines right now is mainly in the hands of the opposition. And by the opposition in that case, I mean Mrs. Aquino and the people around her. I think the church, which is at least 95% in favor of Mrs. Aquino. The only 5% of the church which is not would be in favor of the communists. And the large amounts of people who rallied around her. And one of the real questions then becomes not simply what she wants, but whether she can exercise control over the people who voted for her. And I would not take that as a definite given. Indeed, one of the hallmarks of her campaign was not only that it was surprisingly defensive, that much of the time she had to explain or defend herself against comments she had made or actions she or some of her associates had allegedly undertaken, but the campaign was not terribly well organized. And I think there are real questions of how tightly disciplined or controlled the opposition is. But let us for a moment say that one way or another, there is not massive conflict in the Philippines, and we all hope there is not. What then is likely to happen? Well, again, Mr. Marcos, as I said, will retain the presidency. And I think under those conditions, things in a sense have not changed an awful lot. The key challengers or key problems in the Philippines next week, next month, 6 months from now, will pretty much be the key challenges and problems of the past weeks and past months. And by that I mean economic reform, reducing the role of the Philippine government in the economy, breaking up some of the large concentrations of agricultural holdings, reducing the degree of corruption, and turning around this economy, which for the last 2 years has had a negative growth rate of something on the order of 4 or 5% per year. Second requirement will be military reform, and that really is several things. There's a need to retire some fairly incompetent and corrupt senior generals. There is the need to adopt new tactics that are appropriate for counterinsurgency. There is a need to purchase and deploy equipment, which is also appropriate to counterinsurgency. What the Philippine military does not need are advanced fighter aircraft, what the Philippine military needs is really the tactics that are appropriate and the equipment that is appropriate to fighting in the hills. Unfortunately, if past history is any guide, Mr. Marcos will be loath to adopt many of these economic and military reforms. It is unlikely, in a sense, that at this late stage in his life he will abandon the policies and practices that have brought him to where he is now. And I think that as a result, what one can largely expect is a degree of continued drift, economically and militarily. Politically, the real question is not simply the behavior of the opposition, but beyond that then, whether the scheduled May municipal elections take place, if they do take place, whether they are, or to what extent they are fair and credible, how much violence there is, in a sense, how much a degree of normal political life can take place, can grow up in the Philippines, and whether, as President Reagan said, there can be a place for a legitimate opposition. What then for the United States in all this? Well, the most obvious place to begin is that the stakes for the United States are considerable. The Clark Air Base and Subic Naval Base are vital. It's an overused word, but in this case it actually happens to apply. It is vital for the American capacity to project force and maintain a military presence in Asia, the Pacific, and even the Indian Oceans. Now, over time, given 8 or 10 years, the United States could find ways to reduce its dependence upon these bases. And one could do that through developing other bases, through positioning afloat certain types of military equipment, and so forth. But again, that will take 8 to 10 years. There is no short-term substitute for very, very heavy dependence upon the facilities in the Philippines. Now, heretofore, for the last few months, American foreign policy has been very simple, given these interests. And let me just say also that these are not our only interests, that those are our most important. But we obviously have important economic interests. We have the personal ties now of over 1 million Filipinos living in this country. We have a historical interest as the former colonial power. Indeed, it was only 40 years ago that we gave up the colonial position. But for the last few months, U.S. policy has had a rather easy time of it. We could stand up and say that we simply favored a fair and credible election, and that we did not favor any particular candidate, but we look forward to working with whoever won. And that was fine, except for now we have had an election which was something considerably less than fair and credible, and now in its aftermath, we have to think about who to work with, and not so much that, we obviously have Mr. Marcos, but we have to think about how to work with him. I think that if one looks at what the United States government has said the last few days and weeks, and based on my own impressions from having been in Manila and having been in Washington recently, the outlines of our policy are pretty clear. The first is that we are going to be careful. Let me just also make clear this is my own views on what is going on, but I think it might be a fair surmise. The first is that we are obviously going to be careful about public criticism and too much taking of judgments or positions about what exactly took place in the Philippines. I think you saw that very clearly tonight, that until the election has run its course, until the formal vote is tallied and finalized, the United States is not going to characterize the election. And we are not going to publicly say, for example, that we assume this candidate or that has won. Once the election is clear, and again, if I am correct, or if everyone up here is correct, that Mr. Marcos has won, I would think that our policy will be one of acknowledging that, but rather than supporting it. And what we will say is that we regret the evidence of fraud, we regret the violence, we regret the fact that the election was not as fair as we would have liked, but all the same, we acknowledge that Mr. Marcos is in place, and we will continue to have a relationship with him and with the Philippines. I think we will continue, secondly, to work for economic and military reforms. And here we may have some leverage. We are providing several $100 million of aid every year, and I think what you will see is the increasing provision of aid with conditionality. That is, military aid only if it is spent in certain ways, economic aid only if certain reforms are taking place. I think you will see less of a blank check approach to American aid. Thirdly, as part of this, I would believe the administration will strongly oppose the suggestions of Congressman Solars and others that aid either be reduced, placed in escrow, or somehow, or even more dramatically, cut off to the people and to the government of the Philippines. I think the argument the administration will make is that cutting off aid would be counterproductive. It would simply reduce the ability of the Philippine government to undertake the kinds of military and economic reforms that are necessary, and it would probably lead to a reduction in American access to the bases, and it would give Mr. Marcos a very convenient opportunity to wrap himself in the flag of the Philippines and exploit what I think is the rising anti-Americanism in the Philippines, brought about in part by, at times, our heavy-handed interference in the campaign, and, for example, all the observers and so forth. I think, fourthly, what our policy should do is try to establish and strengthen Mrs. Aquino as the leader of a legitimate opposition. One possibility, for example, might be in several months to invite her to the United States and treat her the same way we would the leader of the opposition of France or Britain or Germany. There's something to be said for making it clear that Mrs. Aquino, and not simply her personally, but the people she represents, is a force to be reckoned with permanently in the Philippines. I think, fifthly, we should probably work with Mrs. Aquino to the extent we have any influence there and do our best to suggest to her that she does not take to the streets, that whatever the short-term temptation it would be to try to bring down the government, she would probably lose, and she would only weaken the ability of the opposition to fight and win another day. That the opposition has actually come quite a long ways in the last 60 days, which they've only had to organize for this campaign, and their long-term prospects remain bright despite the obvious setback they've had in the last few days. I think, lastly, another thing we might do is to strengthen the office of the vice presidency. It's clear that Mr. Marcos' health is not strong. He is highly unlikely to survive another 6 years. It then becomes terribly important for the United States and for others to do their best to see that when Mr. Marcos goes, there is a legitimate succession, that we do not want that process to be cut off. One of the ways to do that is to make sure that the sitting vice president is seen as a legitimate political figure and to strengthen his role, be it Laurel or Tolentino. And I think, therefore, that it is in the interest of the United States to do what it can to bolster that individual's prestige and posture. Let me just end with a few comments. The first is that, despite what many people may think, I think American influence, even if we do all the things I recommend, is limited. That if we do all these things, or even if we do some of the things I would oppose, for example, cutting off aid, I do not think that the United States is in a position to determine what the future of the Philippines will be, for better and for worse. That we should not kid ourselves. We have influence there, but we do not have a determinant position. Secondly, I do not think we ought to do anything which contributes to the sense of crisis in the Philippines right now. I do not think we need an abundance of dramatic gestures from the United States, which would contribute to the sense that somehow in the next few days or weeks, the situation must be brought to a head, and the future of the Philippines is going to be determined for time immemorial one way or the other. I do not think that democracy is going to be decided in the next week or two, and indeed, if we bring too much pressure to bear, it could actually work against the long-term prospects for democracy. I think we should acknowledge that Marcos is there. We have to work with him. We have no alternative. We obviously have a self-interest in keeping open the bases, but we have to balance that, and I grant it is a terribly difficult balancing act to do with reaching out to the opposition and with the Philippine people, and to think very much about the post-Marcos era. Let me just say two things, and then I'll stop. The first is that I think we have to accept the reality that U.S.-Philippine relations in the future will deteriorate. I think to some extent that is inevitable, in part for demographics. More than 50% of the people in the Philippines are under 20 years of age, which means also that more than 50% of the people in the Philippines have only known Ferdinand Marcos as their leader. I think as these people grow up and take power of the Philippines, there is an inevitable distancing that will come from the United States. They will not see the United States as the colonial power. They will not see the United States even as the liberator, but rather they will see the United States as more a country which is associated with a leader which they did not particularly care for. So my own prediction would be that in the future, our relationship will become somewhat cooler. It will become more normal. In a sense, we will move to the post-colonial era with the Philippines, with all that that entails, 1978 or 79, or the situation in Nicaragua at the time. there are major differences. Mr. Marcos does enjoy a substantial degree of support, almost majority, give or take, and he is a very talented politician still. No one should underestimate things. Nor is the opposition of the far left anything like the kind of opposition that there was in either Nicaragua or Iran towards the end. We are still several years away, at least, from that kind of a crisis. And what is important now is to realize that there is no reason to panic about the Philippines. There is still time to work out a transition to a post-Marcos era that will resemble something much closer to what we would all like to see. And I think if the United States does act with a degree of caution and with a degree of a sense of limits about our own influence there, we may actually be in a position to help assist, though not engineer, the kind of transition we would like to see. Thank you.
Thank you all. If I may encourage you to use the microphones to your right and to your left, and there are two microphones on the second deck in the middle of the balcony. We'll try to get to all of you. Please feel free to identify the person on the panel you would like to have answer your question if you have such a wish. Sir.
Mr. Zeitlin, you said that you did not feel that the large numbers of whom you called dispossessed in the Philippines were adequately represented by Mrs. Aquino. Could you tell me who you feel her constituency is?
I think I used the word disaffected. Yes, I think her constituency is essentially in relative terms, the better educated, the more middle class, the so-called liberal, business-oriented individuals. I think generally, those who perhaps in 1972 even supported martial law because they thought it would bring about a better Philippines, and they're disappointed in what Marcos has done and perhaps look to her to provide the same kind of fix. But I don't think any of these people really are willing to look deep into the roots of the difficulties in the Philippines and assess and find solutions to the problems of the vast differences in wealth distribution in the country, the problems of the large numbers of very poor people who live there. That's what I think.
What potential is there for the disaffected people whom Mrs. Aquino did not represent for joining with the NPA in a more of a political military or a political paramilitary alliance than we've seen so far over the next few years?
I don't know, because as I think I've indicated, I don't have much confidence in the NPA. And by the way, I want to thank Mr. Haas, because I'm now relieved of the anxiety of going through 1986 without somebody saying that the communists are going to be in power in now 3 to 5 years. So it keeps coming up year after year, and it's always a distance away. I find them somewhat of a helpless group, and I think they have to be mobilized, and I frankly don't see anybody with that kind of capability. I really don't have much faith in the ability of the NPA from what little I've known. I've met NPA people in Manila. I'm sure some of them are still there. I have got the impression from what I've learned when I was there and from the feedback I get and the people I talk to here that the NPA is seen as another form of totalitarianism, and I'm not sure that people are willing to exchange one form of Marcos totalitarianism for another. I don't see the NPA or the communist movement in the Philippines having much impact, any better organization than the opposition which already exists. I really can't. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how that develops.
Mr. Haas spoke of a rising tide of anti-American sentiment in the Philippines. I'd like the rest of the panel to speculate on the position of American citizens in the Philippines in the years to come.
Understand that question? Yeah. You want to take a shot at it, and then you, Mr.
I don't know. I think with the kind of glitter that through which Filipinos eye the United States, I don't think that the vast majority of Filipinos who now have no direct links with U.S. history, who who neither remember the colonial era or the years immediately after World War II, the early years of independence. I think the United States holds a great attraction for Filipinos, and young Filipinos in particular. If nothing else, they all want to come here because they want to get away from the Philippines, and they don't see a future in that country. That's unfortunate. They see the United States as a place where they can have a future, and the perhaps perspective and emphasis might be the same. But I think the United States is going to exert a great attraction in the Philippines. The school system, as frayed as it has become, is basically an American school system. And I think we still have quite a long while to go before you have a generation of Filipinos who will not be vastly influenced by the United States and by their perception of the United States. I don't think that we have to worry for quite some time that Filipinos, even young Filipinos, will feel anti-American. I really don't.
Mr. Corsino, would you like to comment further on that point and maybe give your view of what Mr. Haas said, Dr. Haas said about the rising anti-Americanism in your country?
Yeah, perhaps I should comment on that first, that there is definitely rising anti-Americanism in the Philippines, and I could predict the worsening of the situation with the statements coming out from President Reagan or from Mr. Speaks yesterday, which apparently associated the Reagan administration once again with the preservation of Mr. Marcos in power. Now, I don't think many of us here realize how much emotionalism this campaign really developed in the Philippines. You can imagine spontaneous crowds, very excited crowds. These are people who voted for Aquino and who feel that Mrs. Aquino had just been cheated from the presidency. I mean, she had won the election, and this election is now being stolen. And here is the President of the United States being viewed as condoning the stealing of this election. Here is Mr. Speaks talking as if the election was just some kind of a stroll through a park. I mean, there was so much tension generated by this election, so much emotions, so many emotions clashing here, people dying left and right. This was a very important political process in the Philippines. And here it was being treated lightly, as if nothing had actually seriously happened in the Philippines. Now, to the extent that these millions upon millions of Filipino supporters who voted for Aquino will realize that to President Reagan and the Reagan administration, such sacrifices would seem to be nothing, then these Filipinos, believe you me, will turn against the United States. Many moderates who have high regard for the United States because they felt that the United States had wanted Aquino to become president of the Philippines because she was the key to the real political stability in the future for the Philippines. Now they will know that President Reagan cannot really be trusted to go against President Marcos. Although it was really time to jettison Marcos once and for all, this is the time to jettison him. Now, with regard to anti-Americanism among the youth, well, let us hope and pray that there will be continuing reservoir of goodwill for the American people among many Filipinos. But as I said, the communists, before this, in boycotting this election, the communist line was this. This is all a big joke. That is the line of the communists. Do not participate in this election because it is all a big joke. Now, if Mrs. Aquino is cheated from her victory, and it is seen that the United States acquiesced in this cheating, then the communists' assertion that this was all a big joke would have been vindicated. And lastly, I would agree that the United States has limited influence if President, for example, were to say something directly, or administration officials were to say something directly. But indirectly, Filipino officials are very, very careful and watch very intently what American officials are talking about the Philippines. In other words, there is influence. There is indirect American influence on the Filipino officials. Now, with this kind of statement which Mr. Reagan just made, that could be interpreted as a signal by the members of the National Assembly who are now, in whose hands the fate of the election now lies. That remark can be interpreted by the members of the National Assembly that they can go ahead and proceed with the canvassing of the votes for formality's sake and the proclamation of Mr. Marcos.
Let me just say two things in response to that question. Partially that I did not mean to indicate that there would be a rising tide. That language is a little bit strong of anti-Americanism, so much as there will be some inevitable distancing. One example will be, for example, veteran power. The next base negotiation with the Philippines will be a rough negotiation, and it will be more like the negotiations we have with other countries with whom we have bases than anything very special. The other is, I think one has to have some understanding for the dilemma the administration or any administration would be in. This question of acquiescing in the election. It is a little bit of you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. On one hand, you do not want to contribute to a tremendous sense of crisis. If the United States starts talking about jettisoning Marcos or dumping Marcos, military coups can come from many directions in the Philippines. And what you may get may actually be worse and may, in a sense, preempt the entire post-Marcos era. So I think the United States has to be very, very careful about trying to add to a sense of crisis or instability in the Philippines. On the other hand, and I take Mr. Corsino's point correctly, we cannot state and do things so we seem to be uncritically supporting what happened, which would alienate people and contribute to anti-Americanism over time. And what that gives you then is the requirement for a terribly difficult balancing act and some mixture of critical support, or at least working with Marcos, which is the reality, mixed with gestures and statements and actions of support for the opposition. And I think if the administration can pull that off, it will be quite a major achievement, but it will not be easy.
Up there, please.
Reagan's statement yesterday, I was a bit disappointed, but not very surprised. When I read an article on the Wall Street Journal today, pledging for realpolitik, defending the bases, keep cool, it wasn't a surprise reading the Wall Street Journal. But hearing statements as this evening, I must say I'm not only disappointed, I'm a bit shocked. Because everybody is sympathetic to Mr. Aquino, and everybody is more or less convinced the elections were stolen. But as Mr. Haas says, there hasn't been a change. Oh, there has been a change. There has been a dirty game, and there has been an election, and there has been on the stage for the whole world, and the United States, they played a role in it. They didn't send only reporters, they sent official auditors. They have a president who said there might have been fraud on both sides. That's a bit ridiculous. If you look at some departments where Mr. Marcos made 13,000 votes and Mrs. Aquino didn't make a single vote. And I think if the United States still want to have some credibility for defending democracy in this world, it mustn't confine itself to cynical statements like those of Mr. Haas, who is only interested, as it seems to me, with all due respect, in the military basis of the United States and not in the idea of human rights and democracy. Then the United States cannot make business as usual with Mr. Aquino or if they do so, they cannot be surprised about anti-Americanism, because what else will they then still expect?
If future questioners could make their points in the form of a question, please, we'd appreciate it.
The U.S. administration said that both parties should work to form a viable government without violence and work to implement reforms. It seems to me that the gist of your argument was that the United States should encourage the Philippines to institute reforms. Several weeks ago, Bishop Desmond Tutu stood on this stage and said that what South Africans need is not a reform of apartheid, but the elimination of apartheid. It seems to me then that what Filipinos need, and for that matter, its allies in the United States, is not the reform of an authoritarian rule, but the elimination of authoritarian rule. I wonder what you, Mr. Haas, would have. What kind of evidence would you need to be convinced that there is overwhelming popular opposition to authoritarian rule in the Philippines?
It seems to me that the Philippine people, by their support for democracy and the way they went out and voted, despite the personal risks a lot of them were taking, one needs no clearer evidence than that there is almost universal evidence in the Philippines for universal opposition to authoritarian rule. That's not the issue. The issue is not the desirability of replacing or eliminating, to use your word, authoritarian rule with democracy. Obviously, that's the goal. The question is how. And both your question and the statement by the gentleman before you raised the question of what is the best way that the United States and other external parties to the Philippines, and for that matter, people in the Philippines themselves, can help make this transition. And is the best way to do it for the United States to stand on a mountaintop and issue very strong statements denouncing Marcos? Is it for the United States to simply cut off aid and walk away from the Philippines? Is it for the United States to quietly, through the CIA or something else, to start fomenting coups? The answer to all of those questions, I would argue, is no. I think that while it may seem simpler or more emotionally satisfying, it just won't work, and I think it would be counterproductive. If one looks, for example, at the military right now in the Philippines, and if one starts talking about bringing the situation to a head where the military would be likely to intervene, I can assure you it will not be the pro-democratic officers of the reform movement who are going to take over the Philippines. If you look at the people who are in position right now to dominate most of the levers of state power, again, it is not Mrs. Aquino and Anito. It will be the people around President Marcos. So I do not see where the United States gains by trying to raise a sense of crisis where if there's a breakdown of authoritarian rule, that it's replaced by something even worse. I think that the United States, therefore, has to stand behind a longer-term process, which will not satisfy people in many ways. I realize that. And it will seem at times that we are acquiescing in a fraudulent election. But all the same, I think that if in the long term things are going to improve in the Philippines, we have to stick to a fairly disciplined policy and not get terribly impatient about trying to help bring about what we would like to see. And I think that means trying to strengthen the opposition, strengthen the office of the vice presidency, try to bring about some reforms which would buy time against the far left, try to, for example, improve the military and so forth, try to get a bit of economic growth. And none of these things are sensational. None of these things are going to bring about successful democracy and economic growth overnight, but they will keep open the possibility, and I think a pretty good one, that the post-Marcos era and the transition from Marcos to what comes after him, which, by the way, I think has already begun effectively, that this will go in a direction that we want to see. And the biggest danger I see right now is contributing to those around Marcos who might have a very clear vested interest in short-circuiting this long-term transition. And I think it is clearly in the interest of the United States, and for that matter of Mrs. Aquino, to do everything possible to make sure that this transition is not preempted or interrupted.
Please, Mr. Corsino.
I would like to say that if there was a time in the past 20 years of Marcos's rule over the country that Marcos's legitimacy is under great question, this is the very moment. In other words, he has just lost an election, and many people know it. Many people know that Marcos is trying to maneuver towards victory through the manipulation of the results. If there was any time in the 20 years of Marcos's rule in the Philippines that he has completely lost his credibility, this is the time. And if there was ever any time in these 20 years that the United States had a chance to finally side with the majority of the Filipino people, this is the time. Now, what will happen if Marcos continues in office? What will happen to American interests? Before this election was called, the United States pressured Marcos to undergo or to undertake certain reforms, political, economic, and military reforms. And Marcos tried to shake this off by calling this election. Now that he has won and he has so many political debts to pay, now that the government treasury is bankrupt, do you think he will now undertake these political, military, and economic reforms which the United States had wanted him to undertake a long time ago? Now consider the fact if, on the other hand, it were Mrs. Aquino who were the president of the Philippines instead of Mr. Marcos. I would assure you these economic, political, and military reforms will go through. Now, it seems to me that some people, rightly or wrongly, would seem to be afraid about a new regime coming into power, as if there would be widespread chaos and anarchy. No, I come myself from the civil bureaucracy in the Philippines, and I may be wrong, but I will say that only the topmost people in the regime can be removed, and the middle and lower bureaucracies in the military and civil service can remain intact. Therefore, I would not agree with any observation that Marcos's hold is very, very strong over the military and civilian bureaucracy. He has a hold on certain top people, top brass in the military and in the civilian ministries. But beyond that, I don't think so. And now that his legitimacy is under question, this is really the time to have him removed. This is the time when his credibility is zero.
Mr. Zeitlin?
No, it's just that I've heard the similar arguments for standing behind an authoritarian government in Pakistan under Yahya Khan. I've heard the same arguments when I was in Nigeria during the Biafran Civil War, and I just don't think it's valid. I think experience demonstrates that events never allow themselves to be so manipulated. I think that the best position for the United States is to withdraw, to detach itself, not withdraw. I think that detachment would work against the Marcos government. There's no other way it can function except against the Marcos government. I think we should assess our real interests in the Philippines. I think most of them, including the military bases, are worth putting aside until the Filipinos themselves sort themselves out. And I think they've demonstrated in this election that they're capable of doing it. And they've been capable of doing it even before the imposition of martial law. It may not be a smooth process, but when Filipinos take responsibility for their own fate, when they do it without depending on the United States, when the United States can have a relationship with the Philippines that is as similar as the relationship it has with Thailand or Austria, then I think the relationship between the United States and the Philippines will be on a secure foundation.
But how should the United States withdraw from the bases or handle the bases?
Well, I think, as Mr. Haas said, perhaps in 8 to 10 years, we will be in a position to withdraw from the bases. I think that process has to start right away. I think the process has to start right away. I think it should start so that whoever is in power in 1991, when the basis agreement will be up for negotiation again, we will say we have an alternative.
You mean start the process
start-
right
we don't-
now
and
to
we don't
develop
wanna
an
pick-
alternative?
Yeah.
To the
Or
basis.
whether assess we really need those bases.
Do you have anything to add on the question of the bases, particularly, Mr. Corsino, since you've worked in the past from the Philippine side on considering the bases in their negotiation?
The problem with regard to the basis as far as Filipinos like me are concerned would be how to reconcile the demands and idealisms of nationalism on one hand and the support for United States defense and security objectives in the Asia-Pacific region on the other. Now, I do not see a real incompatibility between the two objectives, so that in the long run, the United States and the Philippines can work this out in the sense that in the long run, the agreement, the military bases agreement, can be adjusted, modified because it is flexible, so as to make it responsive to both the demands of Philippine nationalism on one hand and the common desire on the part of both the Philippines and the United States to preserve a balance of power in the region.
Well, may I just say one thing? We're talking about the region. I think the future of the bases in the Philippines are not as American bases, but if they are to be kept at all, their future is as a regional defense. And I think the other countries surrounding the Philippines have got to take responsibility for maintaining those bases if they wish to continue to enjoy the benefits of those bases. And I think that area has to be explored.
If I could just add something here.
I mean, 2 months ago, Deputy Prime Minister Goh of Singapore was here, and he was asked this question. He laughed because he didn't want to get involved. Well, he's got to get involved.
Well, I do not really disagree with you there, but I would like to speak on this from the standpoint of the Philippines, and that is at this particular point in time, with the election just finished, the question will be which president is really legitimate enough to be receiving the $900 million in economic and military aid which the United States is supposed to give within the 5-year period from 1984 to 1989. And the second question is, what is the real basic source of stability of a stable political environment for these military bases? Is it a regime which is which is no longer believed in by its own people? Is this the kind of political environment which would be stable enough for the bases to remain? Or is it not that the safe and stable political environment for these bases would be a government which inspires the confidence and support of the majority of the Filipino people? That is the question.
Mr. Haas and Mr. Corsino, and that is, do you agree with efforts that have been made by the United States government as well as the American press to somehow manipulate the outcome of the political election in the Philippines? And a short follow-up on that, and this is more from Mr. Corsino, do you agree then that the United States should continue to have its military bases on Philippine soil beyond 1991?
Ask first.
Two easy answers. The first is the United States has not tried to manipulate the elections. I'd like to think that if we ever had, we probably could have done a better job of it. But seriously, there was no effort to manipulate it. If we had, it would have proven counterproductive. And let me just say, I think if you took a poll, and I don't want to speak for anybody, but if you just took a poll of most American officials, I think most of them would agree that the long-term interests of the United States would probably better be served by a fairly and credibly elected government. I think everyone would agree with that. And if one looks at American foreign policy now as opposed to a few years ago, clearly there has been a very distinct turning away from Mr. Marcos. No one is particularly thrilled with the process, but which we just witnessed in the Philippines the last few days and weeks. So the outcome of the election is hardly one, either the result or the process which American officials applaud. It obviously gives the American government a host of problems, which we've been talking about tonight. And I can assure you that no one is necessarily particularly excited. And they recognize the fact that the lack of legitimacy for the government does raise all sorts of questions about the long-term question, for example, of access to the bases, and whether this will only cultivate or somehow nurture anti-Americanism. So it's given us a lot of problems. So believe me when I say that the premise of your question, that we somehow manipulated the election, I think is about, I'm not sure if it's 180 or 360 degrees, but whichever means entirely incorrect.
Yes, I would say that I don't think the United States or the Western press is trying to manipulate or was trying to manipulate the elections in the Philippines. I could envision the fact that many Filipinos welcome the presence of these Western correspondents, news correspondents. Now, you will understand that many Filipino voters in this election were working very hard to make this election clean. To the extent that the presence of a Western reporter would contribute to deterring fraud or violence or intimidation in the election, then their presence is welcome. And I think you should have read already accounts of some reporters saying that they were really welcomed by many Filipinos out there in the barrios. And with regard to the second question, this matter is precisely what I am studying about here. And that is, to what extent could the Philippines possibly agree to the retention of the U.S. facilities after 1991? And my preliminary conclusion is that if certain elements or parts of the agreement could be changed so as to satisfy some of what we feel is in accordance, what we feel are demands in accordance with the Philippine national interest, then the basis could probably continue after 1991.
Richard, let me say one thing about the bases, which I meant to mention before. Two things. One is that the bases do an awful lot of good for the people of the Philippines. It's not simply an act of charity on their part, or it's not simply a way in which they get exploited by the United States. If one looks at the aid level, roughly $200 million now above that per year, which is closely associated with the base presence, and one looks at the amount of jobs and associated money that's pumped into the Philippine economy, you're talking about $500 million a year that is base-related, which in a country with a GNP of something like 30 to 35 billion is a significant amount of money and jobs. So I think the Philippine people do benefit from the bases. Secondly, so does the United States. And the idea, I did not mean to suggest that we can blithely replace the Philippines. We can't. It would be very expensive, it would be time-consuming, and at the end of the day, no matter what the United States did in the Asia-Pacific theater to somehow try to come up with a new basing constellation, the net result would be something substantially less in capability than what we now enjoy, just given the factors of geography, workforces, and so forth. So the United States also has a clear interest in maintaining the bases. And I would think that beyond 1991, I actually agree entirely with Mr. Corsino, it ought to be well within the wisdom of both our governments to come up with a new base pact, which is in the interests of both countries. If we can do it with Mr. Papandreou in Greece, I should think it would be possible to do it with whoever is running the Philippines.
There was a woman up at this microphone who was waiting very patiently for quite a while. I didn't get to her fast enough. Is she still in the neighborhood? Does she sit down because she got tired? I'm sorry. Okay, sir, go ahead.
I'd like to premise this question to Mr. Haas, but if Mr. Moore doesn't mind, I'd like to preface my question with a few brief remarks. Given the statement of Reagan and the prescriptions Mr. Haas had in his talk, I think most Filipinos are beginning to realize that the Americans really don't have a foreign policy in the Philippines. They really simply just have military bases there in search of a foreign policy. And it is based on two assumptions. First, that Marcos is going to live forever, and two, that the bases are Marcos' personal property. My question to Mr. Haas is, 5-10 years from now, supposing you're the ambassador to the Philippines, there's a renegotiation of the basis agreement. The Filipinos at that time will tell you, all right, your bases are here, supposed to defend democracy. They defend American democracy. But many years ago, you had a government or you had an administration that insisted on supporting a tyrant in our country that destroyed our democracy precisely because of those bases. So those bases protect your democracy, but they destroy ours. How could you answer that question?
I think one would answer a question like that, and I expect it'll be a question that will be raised quite often in the future, two ways. The first is, in a sense, a strategic answer. The other is a political answer. The strategic answer is clearly that there are threats in the Asia-Pacific region to the well-being of the people of the Philippines, even beyond Mr. Marcos. That if one looks at that part of the world, and if one looks, for example, at the ability of the Soviet Union to project military power all throughout Asia and the Pacific with its fleet, with the SS-20 missile, with its aircraft, that there is a real military threat. War in Asia has happened several times since World War II. It is not inconceivable that it could happen again, be it on the Korean Peninsula or elsewhere. We've got wars in Asia taking place right now. The people of Cambodia are suffering what's basically a Vietnamese-induced genocide. So Asia, unfortunately, is not a fire-free zone by any stretch of the imagination. And these bases, conceivably in many contingencies or scenarios, could play a useful role. And I think the Philippines would benefit from a general power balance in Asia as much as anybody else. So I think they serve a function there. The question of American support for President Marcos and the potential inconsistency or incompatibility, the idea that we supported someone, I think to use your expression, who was basically an enemy of democracy with bases that were purportedly there to defend democracy, and how does one explain that? Again, and pardon me for saying this, I think that you're asking too much of the United States. We do not have that kind of influence in the Philippines, that somehow we are the ones who can determine whether or not Mr. Marcos can rule. Indeed, if we ever tried to exercise that kind of influence, I expect many Filipinos would rise up and resent it. And as I tried to say before, I think we can play a role in what is going to happen there. I think we can maybe help the transition, but the idea that the United States can somehow, by what it says or does, or by what it doesn't say or doesn't do, can somehow remove Mr. Marcos from power and usher in a period of democratic rule is a pipe dream. That ultimately the future of the Philippines is going to be determined by Filipinos. We have influence. We have a role to play. I grant you that. But we're not going to call the shots. And that is something that ultimately Filipinos themselves are going to have to do for themselves. And we will be there not simply as observers but as participants, yes. But again, I think that to somehow either blame us or look to us, either way, for determining your own history is to some extent perhaps a cop-out, and some extent probably gives us more credit than we deserve, because we just don't have that kind of a role there.
Mr. Zeitlin.
Well, I just want to point out to you that the disproportionate amount of time we spent discussing U.S. bases reflects the disproportionate influence and importance these had in Philippine affairs. The question, I think, raised by the election is whether the Filipinos will have an opportunity to choose their own government in a fair and honest way, and the bases should have nothing to do with that, and our interests in the Philippines should have nothing to do with that. And in that respect, I think the bases are kind of poison. I'll stop right there.
Question?
You seem to be very nonchalant about the election that supposedly took place this week in the Philippines. You seem to act either as if it hasn't happened or as if the United States didn't want it to happen, or almost pretending, along with Marcos, that it didn't happen. Do you mean to say that you are ready to accept the fact that it was kind of a non-election, and that the United States government should accept that, make no efforts to change what apparently has happened in the Philippines, except that Marcos is just somehow automatically kept in as if there were no vote at all, and that we should make no effort to change things, and no threat of withdrawal of aid, which President Carter did, which worked in the Dominican Republic, perhaps in a few other nations? Are you saying we should do nothing about it at all and just let Marcos and whoever else is responsible get away with it? And do you think there's nothing that we can do to change things right now?
I think we simply have to acknowledge what happened in the Philippines. It's not a question that we approve of it. It's not a question that we support it. It's a reality. And the question is where we go from here. You know, whatever satisfaction we may get from criticizing it won't change that reality. And I think there are longer-term interests, not simply narrow strategic ones like bases, but actually about democracy in the Philippines, which would best be served by the United States not harping on what it cannot undo. I do not think we can undo the fraud that was done. I don't think we can somehow manipulate the tally sheets in order to get a fairer or more credible outcome. That's unfortunate perhaps, but that's life. It's not a question of being nonchalant. The question is, to the extent the United States has influence to exert in the Philippines, and I think we do, what's the best way to use it? Now, some would perhaps argue that we should use it all to try to undo what happened in the election. Fine, that's a legitimate strategy. I disagree with it. I don't think it'll accomplish a lot. I think we ought to use what leverage we have to now worry about life in the Philippines and politics and economics and military facts in the Philippines beyond the election. That's, you know, we each can choose our strategies.
Are you implying we might be able to do something to change things if we wanted to, and that we shouldn't want to?
What I tried to say in my talk and in several answers to questions is that, yes, we do have influence. I think by what we do, for example, in trying to strengthen the opposition, will have an important long-term impact on the Philippines. I think we might have some impact on the succession by what we do vis-a-vis the vice presidency. I think the conditions under which we extend economic and military aid might have an impact. I think our public statements, once we have greater evidence about what happened, about the action when the election counting is over and we feel less constrained about publicly commenting, I think those comments then will have an impact. I just think that what we will do, though, will still fall short, perhaps, of what you would like to see. I would think that in the long run, in some ways, perhaps trying to do a little bit less now may end up with more later on. But again, wise men and women disagree.
Mr. Corsino, to follow up that same line of questioning, you earlier were saying that this is the time of Marcos's maximum incredibility, that this is the time of opportunity for a change with the strong vote that Aquino got. Do you have anything specific to suggest? I mean, that would suggest that you think this is a moment of high potential where something can be done to accomplish a change which the election did not actually bring about. Do you have anything specific to suggest that the United States might do which could take advantage of that opportunity, which you see and which you see may not last very long?
Yes, what I could think of right now is that if President Reagan, in his statement earlier this evening, had emphasized the occurrence of fraud, violence, and intimidation in the Philippines, then this could be a signal which would deter to some extent further manipulation of the results now in the National Assembly. And also, this could be a signal to certain elements in the military and in the bureaucracy that it was high time to begin distancing from Marcos. But the kind of reaction we got from President Reagan was such that it would merely reinforce the desire of these assemblymen who belong to the Marcos's party to finalize, to consummate the manipulation of the results, and also to pull the loyalty of the military and certain elements in the civil bureaucracy closer to Marcos. In other words, I'm not saying that the United States really has great influence in the Philippines, but whether or not Reagan likes it, his words are listened to very carefully by many Filipinos, including government officials. So I cannot see any future if Marcos were going to continue right now. His image, his alleged hidden wealth in the United States, his fake war record, the way he has devastated the economy of the country. I don't see how this man can continue to rule the Philippines. How can this person who is supposed to lead in the national economic recovery effort of the country, who is supposed to preside over the healing of the wounds of war and insurgency in the country, how can this person who lacks credibility do so in such a capacity? No, this is the chance for the United States to turn to a credible leader. And this is the chance to do so because we have just had an election in which this woman won and is now being cheated of her victory. Now, if the United States is going to do something, it has to be right now. Otherwise, there is no future. I don't see any future for the Philippines under Mr. Marcos.
But are you suggesting that the United States do anything other than take a different rhetorical stance?
Well, let me just say, this is just thinking some thoughts aloud, because in the opening hours after the election polls were closed, when many people still did not know who was going to win, there were many indications that many bureaucrats and certain people in the military were about to change sides. Now, at that particular point, maybe it might not have been advisable to do so, but any remark from top government officials in the United States saying that they would be willing to accommodate a new president, whoever he or she is, something to that effect, would have helped to tilt the balance of loyalty in the Philippines towards Mrs. Aquino. And this subsequent manipulation of the votes by certain governors, city mayors, barrio captains, and so on, could have been minimized. But that is a thing of the past. But I'm just telling you that there is a particular moment there was a particular time after the election results were in and Mrs. Aquino was leading so far ahead of Mr. Marcos that certain bureaucrats and military officials were rethinking their loyalty. Why? Because Mrs. Aquino could become president. What would happen to their careers? What would happen to their promotions, etc.? Now, there will still be time because the matter is still in the National Assembly to be resolved.
Mr. Zeitlin, do you have anything to add to wrap it up?
Well, I think to go back to the press conference that we saw at the beginning, to use the phraseology of the man for whom this institution has been named, that the word has gone forth, or has gone out, that Marcos is going to get away with it. The word could have gone out in equally veiled phrases that he wasn't going to get away with it, but it's too late now.
Now, I have been given the hook some time ago, so I want to apologize to those of you who are lined up to ask questions, and I'm sure that the members of our panel would entertain them on a one-to-one conversational basis. After we close up, which we're going to do right now, I want to thank you all for your participation and your patience, and particularly for our panelists for their remarks tonight.